Hey everyone, I'm Ranago here, and this is every Seeker in the game laid out with their signature assets and weaknesses. Today, I'm going to go through and analyze each and every Seeker's abilities. I'm going to do my best to do it in a vacuum. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to get an idea as to how each character feels when I just look at their abilities. I know how I feel about the characters as cohesive wholes, and I know how I feel about their stat lines, so I can analyze that fairly objectively. But I don't know how I feel if I just try to put everything else aside and look at what comes with the investigator. And I'm curious if that'll be different. So I'm going to go through and analyze the strengths and weaknesses of each investigator as generally as I can. Considering I just came off of a video about Harvey Walters, let's start with him. You know what? Let's start by marking out a trend. I'm going to go ahead and drop a bless token on every single card here that says draw either directly or indirectly. And we'll see how many of those are actually going to be dropped. Because it turns out that most of Seeker has draw stapled to it. I just want to draw some attention to that right now before we do anything else. Mandy draws with her investigator card. Minh with her signature asset. Norman with his investigator card. Rex with his signature event. Amanda does it, and it's technically draw, so I'm counting it. But because she's also essentially burning an extra card every turn, it's not as clear-cut that it's purely draw. Daisy doesn't technically have draw, but Old Book of Lore says that Daisy's ability is actually draw, and Joe Diamond is the same thing. The Hunch deck doesn't necessarily mean that Joe Diamond has additional draw, but if you fill it with draw cards, it does, and even if you don't, you're still drawing one extra card a turn just from the Hunch deck. And Harvey Walters and his signature asset both have draw. I expect Seekers to rank very highly in Investigator power because of how many of these cards have draw on them. With only 3 exceptions, Minh, Rex, and Ursula, draw is stapled right onto the Investigator card. With Minh, you have to find her asset. With Rex, it's really a one-off event that's not that good, and he basically doesn't have any draw. And with Ursula, she does have no draw. But generally speaking, draw is one of the most straightforward, powerful effects in the game, especially when your cards are as good and as fast as Seeker cards tend to be. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, we're going to go through and we're going to look at all of these investigators and see how I think of them. Spoiler alert, by the way, I think Harvey is nuts. But let's see how much of that is based on what he's doing. His investigator ability is just anyone at your location basically is allowed to draw one extra card every turn. They have to draw a card to trigger this, but that's not hard to do. In fact, you can always just choose to do it. Spend an action, draw 2 cards is actually just really good. That's the same as playing Deep Knowledge, because Deep Knowledge is draw 3 cards, but you use a card to do it. It's a net gain of 2 cards. Harvey Walters can just turn any investigator's action into Deep Knowledge. And that's crazy. That's insanely strong. That is an oversimplification. Deep Knowledge will push you 3 cards deeper into your deck. It's only the same as Deep Knowledge from a hand-size card advantage point of view. But from a hand-size card advantage point of view, it is the same, and that's still insane. He also has just one of the best stars in the game. A lot of people have stars that give you progressively larger bonuses, and I don't care about that. I'm not taking a test I would have failed at 0 to begin with, so star giving me +8 does nothing. Draw 1 card is insane. I only care about the additional text beyond the bonus, and draw 1 card is insane. It's one of the best stars there is, because it's just transparently incredibly powerful and universally useful. Can we move over to Vault of Knowledge? Harvey's already established himself as a big hand archetype character. It increases your max hand size by 2, and the hand size cards in big hand are the worst cards in the deck usually. You don't want to run an Arcane Enlightenment, you just have to sometimes. So Vault of Knowledge making you never need that is insane. But then even better, after you successfully investigate, which with 5 book you're going to do all the time, choose and investigate your location, they draw a card, which again you can use your ability on. So it's just insane. It's just an additional draw every turn. It fulfills the requirements for you to be a big hand deck as well. It's just disgustingly strong. His weakness, however, is very scary. Revelation: for every 3 cards in your hand, take 1 damage. He's so well defined as a big hand character that his weakness seems like it actually pushes him away from that. That a lot of people view the best way as playing him is to just run a very fast deck, vomit out your deductions, and you're burning the midnight oils, and you're working a hunch as fast as possible, so that Thrice Damned Curiosity can't kill you, even though you are drawing 4 cards a turn. And that's still a good way to play Harvey, but Thrice Damned Curiosity is specifically a card that I cannot evaluate in a vacuum. It's like, oh yeah, Harvey only has 7 health. This just kills you like after the second time you draw it, and a big hand deck cycles 3 times easily. So yeah, you can't play big hand. That's what it does in a vacuum. And then you look at Jeremiah Kirby in Bulletproof Vest, and you can just tank through Thrice Damned Curiosity. The fact is that in a vacuum, Thrice Damned Curiosity doesn't represent anything resembling what actually happens in game, so we have to bring some of that knowledge into this. And Thrice Damned Curiosity, once you accept that, goes from a terrifying weakness that warps your entire game plan to an inconvenience that will cost you a little bit of experience and resources and actions, but ultimately you're actually even safer for the way you've changed your deck building, because now you're able to mitigate so much physical damage to make yourself safe to Thrice Damned Curiosity, that most of the time when the worst case scenario is not happening with Thrice Damned, you're going to have extra health to spare for things like bad Mythos cards. And coming over here to the tier list, I think there's no question in my mind Harvey Walters is going right into S tier. Just stapling 2 draw a turn onto a character is absolutely wild. Giving it additional benefits on top of that, a good Elder Sign and the ability to run big hand without any other hand size increases, it's just crazy. And his weakness is easily mitigated. It's scary as hell. You have to consider it in deck building, but it's not actually stopping him. And even as I say that I have to specifically consider what cards are in the game, if I looked at it generally, I could just generally say there's got to be some form of health soak you can run to tank this. It's not a problem. And that's actually how I got the point where I was running Bulletproof Vest. I looked at that, said, wow, that's awful. There's probably some way to tank that. And then I looked through the cards, and eventually I remembered Bulletproof Vest existed, and I've never cut it from Harvey since. Harvey, from a character card perspective alone, is just absolutely insane. Which is not something that's going to differ very much going into a real game scenario. Let's come down to Joe Diamond. And unfortunately with Joe Diamond, we have to look at his deck building rules a little bit more than we normally would, because it tells us that we need 11 insights, including our weakness, to make our hunch deck. And then every turn we get to see the top card of our hunch deck. And if we play it, it will be played as though it were in our hand and costed 2 less. And that's just really good. Provided you're playing enough cards in that hunch deck that are universally useful, that's essentially draw 1 card, gain up to 2 resources per turn. And we know from real game experience that that's exactly what's happening. There are a lot of events, Working a Hunch, Scene of the Crime, Preposterous Sketches, where you're gaining 2 resources by playing them from the hunch deck, and they're essentially just drawing you an extra card because it's not coming from your hands. The hunch deck at a fundamental level is very, very strong. What holds Joe Diamond down is not the hunch deck. It's his stat line, and that's kind of it. His stat line's just terrible. It's absolutely god-awful. But his ability, the hunch deck, is crazy. And his Elder Sign, it's very slow. It's very, very slow. But putting a card from the discard pile into your hunch deck, or at the bottom of it rather, that doesn't matter much if you're playing according to plan, right? Because that means that you're not going to see that card until turn 12 or later. But it also means that you're probably putting back the best cards in your hunch deck. Things like Cryptic Research are the prime targets for this Elder Sign. So even though it's incredibly slow, it is one of the only Elder Sign effects that can even be described as a slow Elder Sign effect. It's also very, very, very powerful. So I think Joe's Investigator card, when you ignore his stat line, which is his glaring weakness, is actually crazy. His Detective Cults are interesting. They are essentially a 2-handed gun that doesn't take up any hand slots as long as all of your other items were tools. Seekers have a lot of non-tool hand slot items that are very, very good, but they also have a lot of tools that are very good, namely Hawkeye Folding Camera and Magnifying Glass. So the upside of these is really relevant. 4 calls for 4 ammo is a good rate, that's what you expect, and it's fighting at +1 for 1 damage, which is standard for a signature. I'd really like it to be higher than that, +2 fists would have been nice. But if it defeats an enemy, you basically just get your Elder Sign effect. Again, that Elder Sign effect is very slow. That is a benefit that's going to happen much further down the line. And it's not a particularly strong weapon. Ignoring the Elder Sign effect, this is actually just a 45 that takes up 2 hand slots or none, depending on what your other hand slot items were. I'm not a fan of the 45s. They're fine. They're not terrible. They're fine, but I want to say they're strong in some way, but even as I try to say that, I can't find anything about them that impresses me. If you just compare this to a 45 in one of your hand slots, it's not that different. It really isn't. So the Detective Cult 1911s, They're nice insofar as it's always nice if you're playing a fighter to have weapons as your signature asset, because then you need to run less weapons and you have more card slots to play with. I do think detective cults are fine. They're not good, though. They're just fine. Unsolved Case, luckily, is also a complete blank. It's a 2-cost event because you're going to be playing it from your hunch deck, and you have to play it immediately to put a clue down on the location with the highest shroud, and if you don't, it goes into your threat area, you get 2 less experience. The reality is that most of the time you can play this very easily. In these small handful of situations where you can't, it's not that big of a deal. Earning 2 less experience sucks, you hate to see it, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. So where do I want to place Joe Diamond, who I apparently missed the first time through? I don't think he's broken. His signature asset is nowhere near as good as Harvey's. His elder side is nowhere near as good. His weakness is a little bit softer, but even though his ability is, like, very good, I think he's just great. I think he's great, but not excellent. He doesn't have the team utility of Harvey. His signature asset's much weaker. He's doing a similar thing where essentially what his character card says is draw a lot of extra cards and additionally generate a lot of free resources. But his signature strength isn't doing anything and his elder side isn't doing anything. And that's really unfortunate. I actually view them as so slow that it basically doesn't matter, which is very unfortunate. Coming over to Daisy Walker, I've got out her advanced assets as well. Her ability is to take an additional action during your turn, which can only be used on tome abilities. In a vacuum, this is very good. Without knowing what tomes do, an extra action a turn is absolutely sick. So what do tomes do? Well, it turns out they do a lot of things, but none of them compare to Old Book of Lore. So what tomes do is they draw one of the top 3 cards in your deck or someone else's deck. And that's actually sick. That means that this is scry 3, draw 1 every turn, which is incredibly valuable for both yourself and your team. And the other side effect is, just like Harvey's, draw a card. You're going to have a tome in play. In fact, you're probably going to have more than one tome in play, and it's probably going to draw multiple cards and be disgustingly strong. So Daisy's card is absolutely busted. And again, Daisy can't be evaluated entirely in a vacuum because the tome archetype has really important cards, like Research Librarian, that just guarantee you're finding the best tome, the one that you want every game. Coming over to her signature assets, the tote bag doesn't seem that good at first, but when you come over to the Necronomicon and realize that your weakness is a tome taking up a hand slot, it gets a lot better. That said, additional hand slots is generally always good. I usually don't want to run Bandolier, but if I do have Bandolier just put in my deck against my will, I'm not unhappy about it at all. It's not a powerful card, but it's fine. The advanced tote bag is much, much better, but it also has no value additionally if you draw it late, and it's only better if you draw it early. The tote bag lets you play out tome assets as fast. That is much better now. But again, if it's one of the bottom cards of your deck, it may as well be the original tote bag. The original Necronomicon is going to take up a hand slot. It's going to turn your Elder Signs into autofails, and you're going to have to remove 3 horror from it to yourself to get rid of it. With 9 horror, initially that's not too scary, and with a bunch of Seeker allies that have 2 horror soak on them, it's still not that scary because you can put all your horror from other things onto those allies and knowing you're going to have to do this eventually. Or you can just accept that your sick Elder Sign is actually an autofail. The advanced version is actually so much scarier than the original Necronomicon. Auto-failing when you get a star sucks. Getting all 3 of the tokens that are going to have penalties alongside them basically guarantees you fail and get all 3 penalties. So with the original Necronomicon, you can kind of ignore it, but this one you have to get rid of. And if you get rid of it, since you're a Seeker and you draw through your deck very rapidly because you're Daisy Walker, there's a real good chance you're going to see it again. So this Necronomicon is scary as hell. And in fact, this original Necronomicon is still a very serious inconvenience. So generally, I think that her assets and weakness probably weigh her down more than they help her. But her ability is absolutely sick. Take an additional action every turn, draw multiple cards anytime you get a star is kind of crazy. So where do I want to put Daisy? She's not an S tier, that's for sure. I think I want to put her like right below Joe. I think Joe's hunch deck is just better than what Daisy is doing with tomes. Just like it's directly comparable. Well, that's not true. It is drawing, but it's drawing at the cost of an action. So the extra action from Daisy, I think, pushes her just barely over Joe. And they both have a pair of weaknesses and assets that aren't doing much. I think Daisy's is more detrimental, but the extra action that she's getting is just so valuable. Coming down to our next investigator, it's Amanda Sharp. You can't really talk about Amanda Sharp without talking about her stat line. It's 2s across the board, and the reason it's this gimmick stat line instead of the standard 12 points is because at the start of the investigation phase, you're going to draw an extra card, discard the card beneath Amanda Sharp, and choose a card from your hand and place it there. That card's going to be committed to every single skill test you do for this round. Unfortunately, her Elder Sign effect is literally a blank. This is the exact thing I hate to see. It gives you +0, and it doubles the skill icons beneath you, but if I wasn't passing at +0, then I wasn't going to take the test. So Amanda's ability is, I think, one of the things where I can't evaluate it without looking at the card pool. Because if you're duplicating deductions, you're essentially getting free investigate actions. If you're duplicating perceptions, you're getting free draw actions. It matters so much what skills can be under you. And just generally speaking, there's a lot of very powerful effects where you either draw multiple cards or get extra clues. And there are also a decent couple of cards in the game that give you additional actions in a given turn to duplicate that skill more often. So I think even at that relatively general view, her ability is very strong. Her stat line needs some work, but Seeker has access to a plethora of book bumps to keep her safe. It's going to be harder to deal with her frailty if you're just always pushing her book up, which is unfortunate. And again, there are things you can do to help with Amanda Sharp's frailty. Specific skill cards like Promise of Power are very relevant here. It is unfortunate that her star does nothing, though. Coming over to Obscure Studies, it's fine. A 3 question mark card underneath Amanda is going to make her a lot safer. You can play it when you initiate a skill test, so essentially this makes you safe to the Mythos phase. If it's in your hand, you can just put something that doesn't help under you. And then when you find out you have a Mythos test that's really important, you can put this under you instead and give the other card back to yourself. Or you can just use it to have a second payoff turn with deduction. Like, it works very well with Amanda's ability. It very clearly helps her with her weaknesses and helps her to exaggerate her strengths as well. It's very good. Whispers from the Deep is a really gross weakness, though. Losing one stat sucks. It's not important. It's not the reason Whispers from the Deep sucks. The reason it sucks is because nothing else is under you, so you aren't doing any of the reasons you picked Amanda. You probably have something relevant you can do. Like, even if you're doing worst case scenario, move, draw 2, that sucks, but losing a turn from Whispers of the Deep, as shitty as it is, isn't the worst thing in the world. If there's something urgently important, you probably can still brute force your way through it with the skill cards in your hand. You would just rather wait a turn almost every time, given the choice. Coming over to the tier list for Amanda, I think I'm going to put her at the top of A+. She's very close to S tier for me. Her ability is just absolutely crazy. I think where it starts breaking the game is when you start looking at how it specifically interacts with things like Unrelenting and Deduction and Cryptographic Cipher and Eon Chart. I think without looking at all those specific cards, just the idea of it isn't quite as broken. It's still incredibly strong. And since her weakness doesn't do much and her signature skill is very synergetic with her abilities, I think I consider her better than Daisy and Joe. But I don't think she's the same level of just transparently broken as Harvey Walters. Coming over to Mandy Thompson, we know her stat line's busted. How broken is her ability? Well, it turns out it's just as broken. When an investigator at your location would search their deck or the encounter deck, they may either search deeper by 3 or get an additional search result, limit once per round. So if you have access to the ability to scry every turn, this is just draw 1 additional card from scry X every turn. Which it turns out Mandy can do. You would assume that's the case if you're trying to evaluate this in a vacuum, and thanks to Mr. Rook and Astounding Revelation, that's going to be no problem at all. Her star effect is equally crazy. It's +0, but that's fine. I'm expecting to pass at 0 with any test I'm taking. Search the top 3 cards of your deck and draw it or commit it to a test. If able, shuffle your deck. That is just absolutely sick. Or commit it to this test if able is completely unnecessary. But the idea that you can like get a star on a test you knew you were going to fail, search and find Promise of Power, and then pass is kind of gross. It's just extra, though. The real main meat of this is just Harvey's ability, or Harvey's star, but better. Likewise, Mandy's ability, provided you can scry every turn, is just Harvey's ability. This is the point I originally made when I was evaluating Harvey before Circle and Done when I played him for the first time with my tabletop group. Harvey really is just the budget Mandy. Very similar stat line, Draw one, scry and draw, scry and draw. They are so similar. Occult evidence is unfortunately not that crazy. It does very often just say research, draw one clue from your location. In my experience, I very frequently wasn't able to get occult evidence to work because I'd already gotten all of the clues. So I'd like see occult evidence and then pick astounding revelation and then top deck occult evidence next turn at a location with clues. It's not as consistent as I would hope it is, but it is still very strong. It's very often fast action, gain a clue, which is just gross. Shocking discovery is one of the most brutal weaknesses in the game. It's necessary for it to be that bad. Because let's be real, Mandy Thompson deserves to have overzealous as her signature weakness, and this damn near is. Instead of doing the good thing you were going to do, cancel that. That's kind of equivalent to drawing one encounter card, and then draw an encounter card. That's definitely equivalent to the second encounter card from overzealous. So, I think Shocking Discovery is fucking brutal. And I think, in a vacuum, it's a lot more brutal. When you realize that Mr. Rook is a fast action, and there's a dedicated fighter on your team, because you have enough clue power to afford a dedicated fighter, you just use Mr. Rook before your turn, and your fighter knows if you're drawing an enemy, so there's no chance of this ever interrupting your turn to just, like, ruin you with a surprise enemy. It's still brutal. Even knowing that, it's still brutal that Mandy Thompson has one scry that was going to get 2 cards canceled every cycle through her deck, and then draws an encounter card. That hurts. But then you come look at her stat line with 3s defensively, 6/8 soak, and access to secret cards like Tooth of Etzili and Maelson. She shouldn't be that scared of an encounter card. She has people to take care of enemies for her. She has ways of soaking or avoiding the test to begin with. She'll be fine. So this weakness is brutal. I don't want to understate that. I think Mandy's able to deal with it relatively well, and Mr. Rook being a lightning bolt that you can use in your fighter's turn really effectively negates it. But I still think the weakness is brutal, especially in scenario 1 before you have that stuff. And again, this is one of those things where, like, in a vacuum, you don't know if these scry cards have lightning bolts, and it's much scarier, but that's so far from the truth that I don't want to talk about that vacuum. Occult evidence is very good. I think her weakness is much scarier than Harvey's, and her signature is much weaker than Harvey's. Actually, I think she's below Harvey, because yes, her investigator card is better. But occult evidence doesn't hold a candle to Vault of Knowledge. This gets you 1 clue every time you cycle your deck. Vault of Knowledge gets you 1 card every turn for the rest of the game. Yeah, I think Mandy is going to go right behind Harvey in the S tier. I think this is right. I think that Mandy's investigator card is just directly much better than Harvey's. But her signature card is so much weaker than Harvey's. She's still obviously broken. She's absolutely ridiculous, but... And every character I've evaluated so far, I've just been saying the word draw over and over and over again, haven't I? Because that's what all of them do. We're evaluating Seekers. Coming down to men, we finally have an investigator that doesn't have the draw directly stapled onto their investigator card. You're going to have to find it in your deck somewhere. Her ability basically just says skills you commit have 1 more question mark icon once per round for each investigator. And, like, that's not bad, but it's so boring and usually does so little. It's not a particularly powerful effect. It sounds way more exciting than it actually is. It matters a lot more defensively than offensively. If you throw a perception at a test and you go from testing at 7 plus perception is 9 to 10, no one cares. 9 to 10 doesn't matter. But if you're throwing, like, unexpected courage, essence of the dream, like 2 question marks at somebody who has a 3 in their stat on a Mythos test, going from 5 versus 3 to 6 versus 3 is actually a pretty big deal. And I think that's actually a really important part of evaluating this. Offensively, her ability doesn't exist, but defensively, it is actually doing something. Her star effect only works if you committed a skill card to the test, and if you have, you just get it back. That does nothing so incredibly often. Minty Fan's investigator card is really not doing a lot of work. You're a little bit better at committing cards to Mythos test. Very, very rarely you'll get a deduction back. Most of the time you'll get some random card that doesn't do that much back, like a perception or an unexpected courage. But that's if you get a card back. The vast majority of the time, you're not getting a card back from this. Minty Fan is not Winifred. She's not committing a skill card to every single test she's taking. It's just not happening. Analytical Mind, though, it's completely nuts. Unlike her investigator card, her signature asset is insane. Her signature asset lets her break the rules and commit skill cards across the map to anyone. Then as a reaction, whenever she does commit a card, if she's only committing one card, she gets to draw a card. And it turns out there are a lot of cards you'd want to commit exactly one of. It's hard for me to look at Analytical Mind and not mention that Essence of the Dream can give you 4, 5 because you're men, question marks that throw across the map every turn for a Mythos test. And with just that, they're probably going to be safe and you can draw your card with Analytical Mind. Analytical Mind basically changes the rules of the game for you and then draws you a card every turn as well, as long as you can find something to throw a skill card at, which shouldn't be hard. Analytical Mind is like legitimately just one of the best signatures in the game. It does a lot to fix Min's god-awful character card, because her abilities just don't do much. But Analytical Mind is crazy. You have to find it, but we're talking about Seekers, you can do that. You don't want to go first upgrade Mr. Rooks, you don't want to go first upgrade Cryptic Writings, whatever way of millions you pick to find Analytical Minds. You don't want to be spending your opening experience doing that, but you can, and it's worth it, because Analytical Mind is the reason to play Min. And then coming over to the King in Yellow. The King in Yellow is absolutely brutal in a vacuum. So let's talk about it briefly in a vacuum and then how it works in reality. In a vacuum, which is how you're going to experience it if you got to it when it was new or if you played everything in order with limited card pools, which is what I did. You get to Carcosa, someone picks Min, they draw this, and they say, oh, I have to commit my whole hand to a skill test for no reason to get rid of this. And if they do, they're out of fuel, but their weakness is gone. Or if they auto-fail, then they're out of cards and there's no reason to play Min, and they're just fucked. In a vacuum, this is one of the scariest weaknesses in the game because it forces you to commit 3 or more cards to a skill test. And then you have to crush that skill test as well. You can't just auto-fail it, you have to win it. And that's so mean. But then you get a bigger card pool and you find out that Dream Enhancing Diary exists, which is giving you 5 of the 6 icons you need. So you just throw any other 2 cards at it, who cares what they are, along with your Essence of the Dream. And then you probably pass it. If you fail it, cool, that's fine. I'll get the Essence of the Dream back next turn, we can try again. It still sucks to auto-fail this test, but it's so much easier if you do. And more importantly, it's much easier to find a way to get through the weakness in the first place without just burning all your cards. And I will be evaluating the King in Yellow as though I know about Dream Diary, because it is so tremendously relevant to the actual threat level of this card. It's just like Bulletproof Vest and Harvey. And once you're doing that, because research librarians exist to find it, the King in Yellow is not that bad. Major inconvenience, you're not happy to see it, but not that bad. The worst part about it is that it takes up a hand slot just like Daisy's. So coming over to Min, where do I put her? Relatively unimportant weakness, crushingly powerful signature asset, very boring, very unimpressive character card. I think I put her in good. I want to put her in great, but you gotta find that signature ability, and there's no way to tutor out talents even in Seeker, which means you have to brute force it the hard way. She's definitely above C tier. Analytical Mind is just crazy, and nothing about her is actually bad. She might be very low A. I think she's just on the high end of B tier, though. I think she's good, but she's far from amazing. Coming over to Norman Withers. God, is this a character card. You play with the top card of your deck revealed, and you can play it at -1 resource cost once per round. That's not quite draw a card every turn. It can't be a skill card. You have to be able to play it right now for it to matter. But you can build your deck around these things. And that's damn near draw 1 card, gain 1 resource every turn if you're capitalizing on it well, which is not that hard to do. It's really insanely strong. It's one of the best abilities in the game. It has forced after you reveal a weakness on top of your deck, you draw it. That sounds really bad. It isn't, though. Like, you don't want to draw your weakness, obviously, but it means none of your weaknesses ever cost you a draw anymore, because it just gets added to your hand for free. That's actually upside more than downside. It's incredibly strong. His star effect is largely irrelevant, but it is frequently something where you get it, you weren't planning on it, and you're like, oh, hey, I can put this Christopher on top of my deck and then play it for 1 less resource, because I wasn't able to play this other card very efficiently. It's not literally nothing, it is very close, but if you pay attention, there tend to be little ways you get value out of it that add up over the course of the campaign, and it's much more than nothing, which is what it looks like at first. Liberta Ivan is going to be one of those signatures that synergizes incredibly hard with the Investigator card. It will take up your hand slot as a 2-cost asset, but it lets you swap the top card of your deck with a card in your hand, which lets you do that Elder Sign effect where you were having assets in your hand that you couldn't play effectively because they cost too much, or cards on top of your deck that you couldn't play right now. You just swap them out, and then you get to use Harvey's effect. It's very strong. Alternatively, you can just commit that card to the skill test that you're taking, which for skills is just really good. It means your ability works on those now, too. Even without considering the nonsense happening with an Astronomical Atlas, this is still a really strong card. It's not the strongest because it's taking up a hand slot in Seeker, but it's doing a lot of work. The Harbinger is an absolutely incredibly soft weakness. 2 actions, get rid of it. If you don't do that, you can't draw cards from your deck. So a lot of the time, the majority of the time, this is just a 2-action tax. Very, very rarely it will affect you more than that. But it will never happen. And you're like, oh shit, I can't take my turn now. That's never how it's going to be. It's never going to be that big of a hindrance. It might cost you a draw or two if you draw it at a point in time where you're very strapped for what you're doing and you can't afford to spend 2 actions to deal with it right now. That'll suck, but it's never that brutal. As far as signature weaknesses go, a 2-action tax is not that big of a deal. He also has the stuff he came with as promo materials. I don't think I'm going to evaluate him on this stuff because I know that his weakness has to be harsher than this and his strength has to be weaker than this, but I've never actually seen them, so let's take a look at them. Split the Angle is a neat asset, where as an action I can look at the top card of the encounter deck, and if I don't like it, I can toss both it and the top part of my deck. This has a lot more synergy if you have some fast way of looking at the top of it, like a level 3 scrying, instead of using this ability. But yeah, I'd much rather have Libra to Ivan, so I'll be evaluating it based on the other ones, because Vengeful Hound is a monster, and even if it does nothing, it's still harder to deal with than Harbinger. It's a 2/2/3 monster, hitting for 1/1, it'll spawn engaged with you, and you cannot draw or reveal cards via player card effects. So it's a very soft monster, but I mean, it is probably softer than Harbinger because your fighter just kills it for you and only has 2 health. It's not a problem. But the strength is much less than the Libra to Ivan, so I'll be evaluating it based on these. So what do I think of Norman Withers? His ability is one of the best in the game. His signature asset is not particularly impressive. So I think I'd put him between Harvey and Mandy. His ability is better than Harvey's, just like Mandy's. And his signature asset does work, unlike Mandy's, but nowhere near as much as Harvey's. And we're coming down to Rex and Ursula. These are the only 2 Seekers that do not have any sort of draw stapled onto their cards. Rex sort of does, but not really. That event is not enough draw to really impact the way the character is played. Let's talk about Rex first. We're talking about Tabooed Rex, so he has Seduction once a turn. He just has to succeed by 2 to get it. As Elder Sign says, you pass, because it's a good modifier, but if you don't want to, you could fail and draw 3 cards instead. Converting an investigation that would have triggered your ability into drawing 3 cards will very frequently not be worth it, but it also very frequently will. It doesn't always do something, but it frequently does. It's a pretty strong Elder Sign. It's a completely busted character ability, though. Just get 1 deduction a turn? Like, holy shit, that's insane. Unfortunately, his character card, or his signature event rather, not so much. It's a 1-cost event, and you can gain up to 5 cards based on how many clues you have. It's good. Like, I'm not going to look at 1-cost to draw 5 and talk shit about it, it's very good. But it's an event that could be near the bottom of your deck. Drawing 5 is nice, but Seeker has plenty of ways to do this. Like, if you had a rogue or a survivor with this, it might meaningfully impact how I view the character. When I can run Deep Knowledge, Preposterous Sketches, and Cryptic Research all in the same deck, I just look at this and I'm like, yeah, that's an amount of draw attached to an event. What of it? It's not bad, obviously, it's good, but in Seeker, it's very unimpressive. And Rex's Curse is usually not a big deal. It will eventually make you fail 1 skill test, and then it'll go away. Before then, it will make you constantly forget that it's there and inconvenience you greatly as a player by making you reveal extra tokens all the time. But ultimately, it's not the biggest deal. And the reason it's not the biggest deal is because usually Rex is crushing the skill test by so much that you're going to just get through the test by 2 anyway and trigger your ability. Or it's going to fail you, and then you get rid of it, and that's not that big of a deal to fail 1 investigate check. And you draw from the bag so many times that it usually gets out pretty quickly. His weakness is far more annoying than it is bad. So what do I think of Rex Murphy? Like, he goes in S tier somewhere. Deduction every turn? Like, these guys are just drawing a card. Rex is drawing deduction Like, guaranteed. That's pretty crazy. That's absolutely wild. But his signature asset does nothing. His weakness is soft. He's definitely above Mandy. Is he above Norman and Harvey, though? He's definitely above Norman. The question is draw a deduction every turn better than draw 2 cards every turn? Rex's weakness is less important, and his asset does do something. But his star doesn't, really. They're very close. I'm going to put Rex above Harvey because it makes me feel good, but I think they're like just neck and neck. Directly same levels of completely broken. And I didn't realize just how highly I'd be ranking Seekers in terms of their signature cards and abilities. Let's go rank Ursula real quick so we can put someone lower on the tier list. Ursula Downs has the reaction ability after you move to a location, take an action, investigate. You remember Rex? Let's talk about how Rex and Ursula compare. A statement that I've seen a lot that bothers me is that Ursula's ability isn't that great. You only have 4 book. You have to pass an investigate check. I don't agree with that at all. I hate that line of reasoning. If we all think that Rex can easily trigger a succeed by 2 investigate every turn and he has the same book, then Ursula can easily succeed this investigate check every single time. The difference is that if Rex auto fails a check, he just gets to do it again. If Ursula does, well, that's that. I do think that the majority of the time, though, if Ursula is moving, there is no difference in what she's doing, what Rex is doing. It is like 90% of Rex's ability, and Ursula can build a very high mobility deck that moves almost every turn. It's not as good as Rex's ability. It's very, very good, though. Her Elder Sign is like 25% of the time, it's a free action. 5% of the time, it's a free action and a free investigate check. And 70% of the time, it does literally nothing. Jake Williams is 3-2 soak, and I'm sure he has some sort of ability. Other than that, for the life of me, I've never remembered what it is. The first move or investigate action you perform each turn does not provoke attacks of opportunity. But what about the second one? This isn't a solution, Jake. What are you talking about? Anyway, as a reaction, after you reveal a new location, you can draw a card with Jake. So he's like janky wooden green, but she's your signature asset, doesn't give book, and has a bunch of extra text that doesn't matter. It's not nothing. Throwing 3-2 soak into my deck that can occasionally draw a card isn't the worst thing in the world. But like, I've got a bunch of expensive assets in the ally slot as Seeker that are way more important than you. You look a whole lot like a Perception that doesn't draw a card, Jake. This is easily the weakest signature asset we've talked about today. It does basically nothing. Call of the Unknown is potentially very gross, but usually does very little. At the beginning of your turn, you're going to choose a location other than yours, and if you end your turn without investigating it, then you take 2 horror and you shuffle it back into your deck. Ursula just has to deal with this forever, which is quite annoying. But with her high mobility and the ability she has to generate extra investigate checks every turn, you should very rarely actually take the horror and shuffle this back in. So thankfully, her weakness basically just costs you a card draw, because her signature asset's also doing the same thing. It costs you a card draw and does nothing. So what do we rank 70%-ish of Rex's ability with no signature asset or weakness then? Do I like put her right here behind Amanda? She's still really good. Drawing 2 deductions every 3 turns, or whatever rate Ursula finally ends up at, is still pretty damn good. Like, it's very, very strong. Her Elder Sign isn't great. Her signature asset's a blank, but so is her weakness. Like, yeah, Joe Diamond and Daisy are drawing cards, but Ursula's essentially just drawing a deduction instead, just like Rex. She's drawing less deductions than Rex, and her signatures are worse than Rex, but still, she's drawing deductions, just not as many as Rex. I almost feel like I'm being too harsh on Ursula, and she should be at the bottom of S tier, but I'm going to leave her here. I thought I was going to rank Ursula a lot lower, but I can't look at this and be like, oh yeah, you get a free clue every 2 turns. That's bad, right? Because of all these people are being ranked highly because they just draw cards every turn. Drawing a deduction every other turn is probably better than drawing a card every turn. And that's what Ursula does. And that's a cynical view. She probably does a lot more than that in most scenarios. Before I start talking about Seekers as a whole, I want to briefly talk about the Ursula deck that I saw my friend run in Edge of the Earth. We had a lot of situations where I was like, shit, Ursula doesn't get to use her ability this turn because we're at like a 6 clue location. We need to get all these clues. She obviously doesn't get to leave. And that's just not even true. It's so easy to trigger Ursula's ability once you have experience under your belt, because every time that happened, he would Pathfinder out of the location and then Eon chart back in and investigate twice without spending a single action. And yes, of course, part of that is that Pathfinder and Eon chart are great cards, but I just want to show you that it's like really hard to envision a scenario where an end-game Ursula, even a relatively early game Ursula, isn't consistently getting her ability to fire off. By the end of the game, if her ability doesn't fire off, something really weird is happening. So let's talk about Seeker abilities as a whole briefly. There's a whole lot of draw in here. And in fact, the only two that don't have draw stapled onto them directly, or well, in the case of Rex, have effects that are pseudo-draw for deduction, which is the best card you could be drawing. The only character that doesn't either have a deduction style effect or draw stapled onto the investigator is Minh, and she's down here at the bottom. Analytical Mind does a lot of work for her, but it doesn't get her out of good. I didn't realize I thought so highly of Seeker's abilities. I thought they were generally very, very good. Thought they'd mostly be hanging around and great and excellent. I didn't think I'd be putting 4 out of 9 of them in S tier and none of them in fine. The fact that only 1 of them is in good and 2 of them is in great is disgusting. I knew their stat lines are busted. I thought their stat lines and their card pools were the main reasons they were crazy. I didn't realize how good their actual investigator cards and signatures was until I sat down and looked at them today. And they're pretty gross, man. I believe I've alluded to this before. I started making videos on Arkham Horror to establish a body of work because my original video, The Seeker Problem, was too broad of a subject. It touched every aspect of the game. And it turns out I need to make like 15 videos about every part of the game before I can come back and be like, all right, everybody did your homework, you watched the other videos, let's quickly recap how Seekers break every part of the game. And I didn't realize that their abilities were part of the problem, but boy howdy, their abilities are a big part of the problem. So even though this was a little bit surprising to me how highly I rated these, I'm sure a decent number of you were watching like, yep, all the Seekers are broken, what a surprise. And I didn't think this was the part of Seekers that was broken. It turns out that it's busted all the way down, though. Anyways, I've been rather incoherent. That's enough for today. If you liked the video, then like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.